See, now all Lakes Area Music Festival activities are made possible by the voters of Minnesota through grants from the Five Wings Arts Council and Minnesota State Arts Board, through a legislative appropriation from the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. I'm Chloe Fedor. I'm the artistic advisor of Baroque programming here at the Lakes Area Music Festival and longtime participant since year 2, which is quite amazing. I'm going to be talking about a program for us and them that we're presenting on August 6th and 7th in Brainerd, Minnesota. This is an exciting collaboration because unlike the last couple of years where we had a program completely dedicated to Baroque music, this time I worked in conjunction with Christian Reif to present something that's excitingly a Baroque sort of concept or a stylistic compositional style, which is the Concerto Grosso. And we're using both a couple of fantastic pieces written by living composers in this style that stems from the Baroque era. So I'm going to be telling you about the Baroque end of things, but Erilyn Wallen and Samuel Carl Adams have both written fantastic pieces that got inspiration from this Baroque tradition that I'll talk a bit more about. There's a quote from Samuel Carl Adams, one of these composers, who said, "What fascinates me about the Concerto Grosso is that it suggests a different kind of narrative. It isn't necessarily about one individual trying to overcome or join some kind of opposing force, but much more about cooperation and fluidity." And I think that quote is beautiful and accurate in that he seems to be contrasting what we come to know from a concerto form. Of course, we love to hear a soloist play a concerto, and we love to hear the point of view of the composer who wrote for that one instrument, taking it often to new technical heights. And we love to get the point of view of a specific artist and get to know that, whether it's a violinist or a horn player, whoever is playing the solo at that given time, peering into, getting to know their style and their sound and their point of view. But there is this sense often of the orchestra as kind of a backdrop, and or they're just providing structural, getting us from point A to point B so that the soloist can sort of dance around that and show off a bit. And it's a wonderful type of musical form in its own way, but it's also lovely to bring back this tradition of the Concerto Grosso, which has a small band of soloists. So a concertino often was 2 violins and a bowed bass player. You could say a cello often. So you have 2 violins and cello at least, if not, maybe some violas as well, playing these solo bits in alternation with the masses, which are a bigger ripieno, you would call it, section. So it's this alternation like a solo with an individual soloist, but instead it's this smaller dialogue among just a few players who have solo parts, and then really reinforced by more people playing on a certain part. Like, it was one of the original orchestral textures that you would hear, and it had a lot of benefits to being able to rehearse with just a few soloists and have players that know each other well. And then let's say you're in Rome and you have visiting royalty, and you're putting on a big celebration for whoever happens to be in town. You can have forces as big as you want in these ripieno sections playing, and still have the soloists dedicated and well rehearsed. So one of my favorite types of Baroque pieces to play are Concerti Grossi, because it feels like this really deep camaraderie between the players. You have the dialogue of the soloists, and the musical material often really works as one, as opposed to what Sam was talking about, feeling like as the soloist is really pitted against the orchestra. So it's a real sort of team effort, and that collaborative, warm spirit is what really draws me to the Concerto Grosso. I think when talking about, trying to get historical context on the Concerto Grosso and where it came from, that can be a bit dry. I think an interesting thing to look at is the evolution of instrumental music in general, and specifically violin band, the violin band and violin dominated groups that until today, if you look at an orchestra, so heavily, the string texture is really important, and the concertmaster has continued to play a really important role in a modern orchestra. So it's interesting to look back at what was originally a completely subservient role to the voice. The first instances of a concerto grosso-like texture are also found in vocal repertoire oratorios dating from around 1675, where you just want the balance to work. So we do this today where you're in a rehearsal and the texture is a little loud for the soloist. So you say, just cut all the strings except for a single stand or a single player. So it was just something of a practical nature to have one singer and you're having just a single string player on a part to help sonically with that. But as the violin really gained independence and a personality of its own, it came into its own as something where the violins were really the featured soloists or whoever else, and especially composers today can use whatever combination of solo instruments they choose. So if we look back at even music from the Renaissance, very often instead of having a specific instrumentation really set or fixed by whoever's writing the music, instead we have parts that generically written out for voice is the most important, and instruments can double if they choose. They could be there or not be there, or they could substitute if a singer is missing. But in any case, it was really all about the singers. And then you see this polychoral tradition of having multiple choirs. And that was a way to play around with just sonic, the earliest surround sound was having a choir on this choir loft and then a choir on this other one, and they're singing in alternation with one another. So it's coming from here and that's coming from there. And a place like St. Mark's in Venice made this style really, really popular because they had the two choir lofts, and they had this ability to have different opposing forces imitating one another in this really effective way. And I think that imitative texture is something that we see a lot in the Concerto Grosso, because the two violin soloists are alternating with one another and sort of playfully sharing the same material. And I bring up the polychoral tradition because we can trace back, this starts, it's certainly not an orchestra as we know it, but you have instruments that are divided by timbre, you could say, or just you have the violins and the flutes are going to play with this choir while the trombones are playing with this other choir, and you start to see composers dabbling into these different sonic realms of separating this instrument from that instrument, but without a clear picture of what these instruments mean yet, and without the trust of having solo sonatas, certainly not concertos yet for those instruments. If we look at something like Monteverdi's Orfeo, a story with a plot that we all know, Orpheus and Eurydice, and Orpheus's trip down to the underworld, we can get a sense of what some of these instruments were used to depict in his compositional score through the story. So we have recorders for the pastoral shepherd, evoking that shepherd sort of pastoral feeling, and we have trombones and cornetos early brass instruments as the underworld, that sort of dark, mysterious sound, and the string players, the violins, and so forth were the heavens and sort of celestial beings. So now, I mean, very early on, instruments started having some symbolism tied to them, but composers are starting to dabble with, you know, certain sound worlds are taking on certain meanings, although we certainly don't have any semblance of the orchestra as a unified force as we know it. And I will say that while researching the inception, the origins of the orchestra, a really good resource is the book The Birth of the Orchestra by John Spitzer and Neil Zaslaw. It's really takes one through different ways to define what an orchestra is and talks about some of these beginnings, and by region as well, how some of these cities cultivated you know, this interest in this instrument or that instrument, and what was going on in the cultural climate at the time. But I think because we have a string dominated program this year, we're going to turn our attention to the violin bands and how they gained popularity in a couple of really important places. First of which was Paris, and you could say France in general, because it was so centralized, with the king loving his violin band, the 24 violons de bras, as they're, excuse my French lack of pronunciation, but the 24, they were famed throughout France. They said you could hire the 24 violins of the king, and violins means violin band group. So there were violas and cello, etc. In this band, that you can hire them. If someone in your family is depressed, they can hide behind the curtains and surprise someone with their beautiful playing and cure them of their depression, and all your problems will go away. So there's this sort of mysticism around the 24 violins of the king. And we have Lully as well with his Le Petit band, this really deep tradition of string playing that was really important in France. And one interesting feature about French violin music of the mostly the 17th century, late 17th century, early 18th, was this 5-part texture. So there's this richness of this added viola lines. Instead of, we tend to hear 4-part texture. We hear string quartets, 4 parts. Orchestra-wise, the strings are in 4 parts often. So that really took off, as was the style in Italy, particularly southern Italy, but in France and northern Italy as well. You have this rich 5-part texture that on our concert, for us and them, you are going to hear the very last piece by Georg Muffat, who's our one French representative. He was a student of Lully. So we have this whole tradition, and I actually want to show you guys, because I mentioned there were violas as well, and this 5-part texture meant that there's an upper and a lower viola part, and instrument sizes were a lot less standardized back then. So you have a number of different, even now, I guess violas are the least standardized of the instruments, but you have these huge tenor violas, and I have a photo. Just want to show you the Met Museums. This is a Jakob Steiner tenor viola there next to a violin for size. So this one's from the Met Museum, and this is just a taste of some of the different size string instruments in this band in order to get this really rich harmonic texture in which you have 5 parts, sometimes 6, sometimes 4, it depended, but generally speaking, this 5-part texture characteristic to French music. So that I would not want to play something myself that large. I get tendonitis, but it really made for some real richness in the harmony there in France. And France continued to lead the pack. They were the first to really, you know, to elevate the violin to what it is really today. The English court followed suit. So Paris, I'd say around the second half of the 16th century, the violin bands were all the rage with the king and thus with the country. England, beginning of the 17th century, they also incorporated violin bands into their court. And eventually to Italy, where whatever Italy was doing by the second half of the 17th century, especially and into 18th as well, was just the cultural phenomenon. So once it took off there, it was the fate we see was pretty much sealed until today, which is quite amazing. I started to say that France led and Paris led the pack, not just in terms of courtly violin playing, but later on they had pretty much the first public concert series. In 1725, the Concerto Grosso in Paris was the first of its kind. It was the first opportunity for Paris to have a regular orchestra that had a subscription series. And it's that important shift from court to, you know, from private sector to more public for the concerts, and that was in 1725. Of course, the upper echelon were the ones that could afford these concerts. So it's not completely open. Accessibility has always had and continues to have an issue. You know, classical music has an issue with accessibility, but not at the Lakes Area Music Festival where the concerts are free. So that's great. But at least there's this shift that it's not only royalty who are enjoying the string playing now, it's going into the public sphere, which is interesting. But at that point, by the time 1725 rolls around and there's this concert series, everything is, as I mentioned, influenced by Italy. Italy is all the rage. There's some rivalry with stylistically France versus Italy, but that Concerto Spiritual series had a lot of visiting artists from Italy, where especially the violinists were being trained in ways that was just phenomenally virtuosic, really, really interesting. But we're going to turn to, it seems that all roads pretty much lead to Rome, even with Georg Muffat, our French composer on the program. He, as were the others, Corelli, we're going to talk about Corelli himself, but we also have Locatelli and Handel on the program. They were all heavily influenced by Corelli, and Muffat, who is our French representative, did go to Rome to study with Pasquini, another composer, but was so taken by Corelli and so inspired by him that Corelli helped edit and the set that we're going to be performing from. And Muffat's original compositions were premiered in Corelli's home even. So they had a close relationship of a mentor and a mentee. Rome, the scene in Rome was different than Paris. It was the nucleus of the Catholic Church. So there's a lot of wealth around. There was a lot of ambition for cardinals and such who were interested in being elected pope. So you had these aristocratic families vying to be on top, and had these ambitions of just sort of bolstering their prestige. So what this meant for music was that there were a lot of potential patrons for the arts, patrons for individual musicians and people willing to put on festivals and concerts in their name. And you can't talk about Rome without talking about Corelli, but just to give a bit more of a sense of what the whole cultural climate was like there. Even the churches could be patrons for, they had musicians on the payroll. And this sounds a lot like my freelance career as a historical performance person today, which I find interesting, that Rome was able to cultivate these multiple string ensembles. The instrumental music took off probably because, unlike France, where opera really reigned supreme, you have, mostly secular music is frowned upon for, in general, and for a lot of the year. Instead, you have oratorios and long dramatic works that had a sacred text and sacred messages, but still were able to infuse all of the excitement and verve of an opera, but just a little bit different. So there are cantatas and sacred cantatas and oratorios, and instrumental music, I think, was able to slip in and really get a stronghold, because it was not the most religious thing to have no text, but it wasn't, there was nothing sort of blasphemous about it because there isn't the text. So I think Corelli and people who were pushing and experimenting with instrumental music, when they had so many wonderful instrumentalists around, particularly violins and violin family instruments, it really took off in an impressive way. So there's that competitive sort of the competitive opportunity for many orchestras to exist, which is really special to Rome at the time. And we'll turn our attention specifically to Corelli. The Corelli piece on our program is the shortest of the Concerti Grossi by just a couple minutes, but it's this compact and sort of perfect jewel of an example of the Concerto Grosso, and why Corelli was so influential to all the rest of the composers. He's sort of the ultimate freelance concertmaster that existed in Rome in the time he was active, from 1680 to 1709. He was listed as leading just about everything coming through Rome, where there were more than 10 musicians at a time. Born in Fusignano, but trained in Bologna, so he's known as the Il Bolognese, or at least that's how I pronounce my pasta. But yeah, so from Bologna, the famed musician from Bologna. He didn't write vocal music, which is very, very rare to focus on instrumental. And I already mentioned that perhaps Rome was the perfect opportunity for him to write, or to have violin-based music really take off, just because of the players and the demand for classical music at the time. He was contracting, he was putting together the orchestras, leading rehearsals, composing, or if he wasn't composing, if there were, let's say, an oratorio by Alessandro Scarlatti, he often would write the overture type piece at the beginning, the sinfonia. So his compositions were interspersed or alternated often with another composer. So he just sort of bolstered the program, made it heftier, and infused his own personality in many ways, which is very interesting. We talked about the instrumental music. I'm gonna just share another photo of what one of these ostentatious festivals or performances could be like. This is from 1675 in Rome, Corelli leading. You see a little, it's very hard to make this out, but you get a sense of the grandeur of the occasion. And if you see the orchestra there on the steps, Corelli and his other Concerto Grosso partner are standing on a little pedestal, so they're a little bit raised up for the others to follow suit. So then in the front you have the harpsichord, and the band that's there with the singers primarily accompanying the singers. They're in front, the basso continuo instruments. So just let that sit for another second, and that's all good. So Corelli has made an appearance before. If some of you heard the concert that was recorded, Beauty in Chaos, Hope in Order. I came up with the title, I'm trying to remember it. And that was a presentation of mostly what we don't get to hear so often, which is 17th century music when we talk about Baroque music. At some point, this wild, sort of unstructured, very exciting music to play. But in that concert, Corelli was the order side of it. You have the chaos, and then you have the order. And the order was Corelli's set of Opus 5 solo sonatas for violin and continuo that were published on January 1st, 1700, ushering in a new era and a new style of music. So something about the structure of Corelli is, it's just so effective. You have these walking bass lines that the bass instruments are playing, and because you can't talk about Baroque music without touching on basso continuo, I will just mention that one of the coolest, or probably the coolest thing about Baroque performance practice that differs from what we normally see with a modern orchestra are the continuo players. So everyone playing everything from the cello on down to double bass, and the keyboard instrument, the harpsichord, the plucker instruments, the theorbo, the really large lute with the bass strings, they're all playing a single bass line. Usually the cello and the double bass is just playing a single note, but they can also improvise a bit. But the keyboardist and the theorbo player, whoever is plucking, they're all basically jamming over this bass line in which they're free they're providing the harmonic foundation of the piece, but there's also something gilded and elegant and really masterful about their voice leading and playing around with different ways to express and bring to life this bass line. So the melody players are playing their line, but really the most interesting stuff is whatever those basso continuo players are doing at a given moment. Just want to touch on that. And you'll see the soloists are usually, it's 2 violins and a bowed bass player, so they're not realizing the continuo, but they're playing the very important bass line. And Corelli's bass lines, he's known for these walking bass lines that are really melodic in a lot of ways themselves, but very structured, and it has just the right amount of structure that whatever is going on top with the violins, the melody instrument, also takes on this freedom over this bass line at the same time, just enough structure to just feel a sense of warmth and a sense of it just feels good to play and to hear, and it's like something quite very effective enough that Corelli is the father of really what we think of a violin sonata as well as the Concerto Grosso form. And because something I really like about Concerto Grosso is that we have a little bit of freedom and flexibility, less so than the continuo players, who can really do whatever they want. There are plenty of rules, but who can choose their own adventure with a bass line. The 2 soloists on top are able to play around a little bit with some ornamentation. It's hard for me to demonstrate anything specific that we're going to play because it's just 1 violin, not 2, and it's maybe not the most effective. But instead, I thought I would play just a bit of a sonata. Luckily we have compilations of, let me pull up Here I have a photo of a Corellian violin sonata from his famous Opus 5. And here you don't all read music, but probably plenty of you do. The green arrow at the bottom is the original, very simple, the simple violin line as it's printed, but because ornamentation was such a part of what performance practice was back then, I'm just going to play my first notes of the day to play. Let me just tune up for a second. I'm going to play this simple version of what Corelli wrote. And although we don't have Corelli's ornaments specifically, these are different ornaments that were written down, which of course is not so common, but they're examples of how the ornamentation developed a bit over time. Most of these are from Corelli's lifetime, so or a bit after Corelli's lifetime, but just the generation after. It's condensed enough that it doesn't get too crazy. But even if you don't read music, so this is the simple version of what is on the page. So very simple, very Corellian in that it gets to the point, it's tuneful, not too fancy. I would say you would, performers of the time would know to add at least one trill to that. But very simple, and most music we play these days, it's on the page, you play it, that's probably what the composer wants. But here's an example. I'll go with the earliest anonymous Walsh, just from 1711. So this is just 11 years after the publication. Here's an example of what someone thinks you could do to ornament this line. So ornaments, we stole rules basically from vocal traditions at the time. You have vocal treatises, and later on Gemignani, who has a version here, I'll play in a second, also published his own treatise for violin. There were quite a few, but his really stood the test of time for people looking to find out what could be a way to play stylistically music from the Baroque era. And his ornaments to this simple tune are as follows. So just some extra vocal flourishes. I won't play too many of these, but because I actually don't know how the audio is coming across when I'm sitting so close to you. But here is one that's interesting because it's supposedly a pupil of Gemignani's. Well, Gemignani's pupil, so it's one generation farther away from Corelli, but written before 1721 probably, so not too bad. Okay, so there's some audio issues anyway, so I'll leave it there. I'm just playing a few examples of what you may see on the page for Baroque music versus what were some of the performance practices of embellishing in ways that added a personal touch. And with that, I'm basically covered the information I wanted to cover, to give you a sense of the progression of instrumental music over the years, and how there was fertile ground in Rome specifically to have this Concerto Grosso style come out, and have the onset of soloists playing in alternation with larger forces. Just because I didn't mention Handel. Of course, Handel is one of the most household names in terms of composition, and whenever he moved through Rome, Corelli was his concertmaster, famously Handel's Resurrezione, big oratorio, and it's long considered that Handel's music, whatever he wrote while he was in Italy during his youth, was really the most fruitful time for him to be writing. He was very, very inspired, and was a lot of the music that that he borrowed and recycled from himself with good reason, because it was just some really good stuff there. And this particular Concerto Grosso that I chose to open the program is one that it's music Handel chose for his occasional oratorio. So it pops up again in part 3. It's the beginning of a section on Thanksgiving for victory. So it's this victorious sort of martial kind of patriotic feel to it, which makes sense because the occasional oratorio was basically a patriotic piece written hastily when the Stuart armies were invading England in 1746. So Handel was in England, and he was writing something in solidarity for England. And I thought it was interesting that something, that music that is secular, doesn't have a particular meaning attached, could evoke something so strong that he used it to say, like, this is the sound of victory. I thought that was very interesting. And I will say that Corelli did have a little bit of, he did butt heads with the public slightly, sometimes bringing instrumental music near the Pope, near the Vatican. There were accounts of a performance just outside the Vatican walls, and the village people nearby were throwing stones at the players because it was just heretical that they were playing something that was not religious music near the Vatican. So even so, he extremely influential, is probably responsible for why a lot of violin music is dominating even today, because Italy was so very influential. Locatelli also spent time in Rome, although he only overlapped a bit before Corelli's death, but definitely inspired by that same tradition. And so we're going to present you with a very, very influential art form that clearly some composers that are living are still thinking is a really interesting way to play around with dialogue between instruments, smaller soloists, dialogue, then bolstering with larger forces, also in this sort of kumbaya feeling compositional style in which everyone's pretty much in it together, and yet you can still showcase different types of balance and different sort of instrumental combinations, which I think is really special. I'm just going to see if there are any questions before I depart. Okay, no questions at all. So that's it. We look forward to presenting this concert for you on August 6th and 7th. And thank you for listening.